She didn't know. That was the part that stayed with me as I stood there. Celeste had just finished dismantling a man she believed she understood completely, the ex-husband she'd walked away from 8 years ago, the one she'd always written off as small, tired, and going nowhere. She saw the plain suit, the old watch, the silence, and read all of it as proof she'd been right. What she never considered was what that silence actually meant. And the man she'd just called pathetic in front of everyone, who exactly had she chosen to underestimate? If that question hits close to home, if you've ever been the person in the room that nobody thought would amount to anything, this story is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. My grandfather's tools smelled like iron and cedar. He kept them in a wooden box he'd built himself, each wrench and chisel fitted into a foam cutout like something worth protecting. When I was 9, he let me carry that box from his truck to a job site on the south side, and I remember thinking I was holding something sacred. He told me that day that a man who builds things with his hands leaves something behind even after he's gone. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was much older, and by then I'd already sold the box. I sold it the spring. Celeste enrolled in a professional development program at a training center downtown. She'd found the course herself, gotten excited about it in the way she sometimes did with things that felt like a shortcut to a better life. The cost was more than we had sitting in our account, and I didn't want her to give it up because of money. So I listed the tools online, took what I could get, and didn't tell her where the payment came from. I just said I'd figured it out. She thanked me the way you thank someone who holds a door open quickly without looking back. That was the version of my marriage I lived inside for years. I told myself I was patient. I told myself I was building something the same way my grandfather used to build things quietly without needing an audience. What I didn't understand then was the difference between patience and permission. I had given Celeste permission to look through me, and I kept renewing it every time I said nothing. She left me for Everett Sloan in the fall of what would have been our 9th year together. I found out about the two of them months before she said anything out loud. I didn't confront her. Part of me kept waiting for her to come back on her own to choose what we had over whatever she thought Everett represented. He was the kind of man who knew how to perform success, the right suits, the right language, the confident handshake that made people feel like they were in good hands. I watched Celeste look at him the way she'd never quite looked at me, and I kept working double shifts and saying nothing as if the answer was somewhere in the silence. By the time she handed me the divorce papers, I was almost relieved. There was nothing left to wait for. The 8 years that followed are not a story about suffering. They are a story about what happens when a man finally stops asking for permission to take himself seriously. I poured everything I had into the company I'd been trying to build in the margins of that marriage, every early morning, every underbid contract, every handshake deal that led to a bigger one. I moved from the South Side to a house in Gold Coast. I hired people I trusted. I built a reputation for finishing what I started on time and under budget, which in the infrastructure business is rarer than people realize. And I did something else quietly without attaching my name to it. I set up a scholarship fund at the high school I'd attended in my 20s. I didn't want recognition. I just remembered what it felt like to need a door opened, and I wanted to open a few. 3 years ago, I married Ariel. She ran an education nonprofit serving children in some of the hardest zip codes in Chicago, and she had the kind of clarity about her work that I'd always envied in people who knew exactly what they were put here to do. She didn't fall in love with me because of the company or the Gold Coast address. She fell in love with me, I believe this, because of the things I did when no one was watching. She noticed that kind of thing. 2 days before the reunion, I signed the final documents on a $412 million infrastructure contract with the city of Chicago. It was the largest deal I'd ever closed. Ariel brought champagne home that evening, and we sat at the kitchen table and toasted quietly, just the two of us in the same kitchen where we'd eaten takeout from paper bags during the lean months of our first year together. Some victories don't need a crowd. It was Rochelle Banks who convinced me to go to the reunion at all. She'd been my closest friend since high school, the kind of person who says exactly what she means and expects you to do the same. She called me 10 days before the event and made her case without softening it. She told me I'd been carrying something for 8 years that I hadn't fully put down, and that there was a difference between moving on and actually finishing with something. She didn't mention Celeste directly. She didn't have to. Before she hung up, she mentioned almost in passing that Danica Reeves was going the quiet one from our class, the one who now did contract auditing for the city. Rochelle said she didn't know exactly how the evening would go, but that she didn't think it would be boring. I almost said no anyway. I'd built a life that didn't need that room. I had a wife I loved, work that mattered, and a peace I'd earned the hard way. But something in what Rochelle said stayed with me. There are doors you think you've closed that are still open a crack. I wanted to walk back into that room as the man I'd actually become, not to prove anything, not to perform anything, just to stand there as myself and let that be enough. The night of the reunion, I wore a simple charcoal suit and my father's stainless steel watch. Ariel had a board meeting for the foundation and promised she'd come as soon as it wrapped. I kissed her goodbye in the doorway and drove alone to the Chicago Marriott on Magnificent Mile. The ballroom was everything I expected: warm light jazz from a live trio in the corner, champagne in long-stemmed glasses, and 40-some people in their early 40s trying to figure out whether they were happy with the choices they'd made. I saw a few familiar faces near the bar. I was moving toward them when Celeste appeared. She crossed the room with the kind of confidence that comes from having rehearsed something. She stopped a few feet from me, tilted her glass slightly, and said what she said about the tool belt, about how tired I looked, about some things never changing. The people nearest to us went quiet in that particular way people go quiet when they're trying to look like they're not listening. A few of them laughed when she laughed. Standing beside Celeste was Everett Sloan. He wore a suit that fit the way expensive suits fit, and he held himself like a man who was used to being the most important person in his immediate vicinity. But I noticed something almost immediately. His eyes moved to my left wrist the moment I lifted my hand. He looked at my father's old steel watch, not with the contempt you'd expect if you were trying to dismiss someone, but with the careful attention of a person doing mental arithmetic. He was trying to figure something out. He recognized me, or almost recognized me, in a way Celeste couldn't have understood and wouldn't have thought to ask about. Across the room, Danica Reeves stood alone near the far wall with a glass of water and the expression of someone who had come to observe rather than participate. Her gaze found Everett, held there for a moment, and what I saw on her face wasn't surprise. It was the quiet recognition of someone who'd just confirmed something she already suspected. None of that was visible to Celeste. She was still talking. She said that she'd heard I was still doing construction work the way people say it when they mean something else entirely. Then she asked again, louder this time, whether the wife I'd mentioned was real or just something I'd invented to avoid looking like I'd spent the last 8 years alone. I had enough information in that moment to end the performance she was putting on. One sentence, $412 million, City of Chicago, signed 48 hours ago, and the room would have shifted completely. I knew it. I could feel the shape of it. But here is the thing I understood standing there. If I said it to make her feel small, then her opinion of me still had power over me. If I needed her to know, I was still handing her the measuring stick. And I had spent too many years inside that dynamic, working harder, sacrificing more, waiting for her to finally see what I was worth, to walk back into it willingly on a Saturday night in a hotel ballroom. I looked at her steadily and said that she should probably stop before she said something she couldn't take back, not for my sake, but for hers. I said it quietly, without heat. She heard that as weakness. I could see it happen in real time, the slight lift of her chin, the way she stepped half a step closer to Everett, the decision she made to push harder. She pulled him forward by the arm, introduced him as proof of something, and then asked me what exactly I had to show for the last 8 years, besides a worn-out work jacket and a wife nobody had ever seen. She was still smiling when the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The room didn't go silent all at once. It was more gradual than that, the way sound drains out of a space when something happens that people aren't sure how to react to yet. I didn't need to look to know who had just walked in. I'd know the rhythm of those footsteps anywhere. Celeste's smile held for exactly 2 more seconds. Then something moved through her expression, not quite fear, not quite recognition, something between the two, and she turned toward the door. Ariel walked through that ballroom the way she did everything without performing it. She wore a deep navy dress and her hair was pulled up, and she moved through the room with the unhurried ease of someone who had no reason to rush and no one to impress. Several people turned to look before they even knew why. That's the thing about genuine confidence, it doesn't announce itself, but rooms respond to it anyway. She came straight to me. She took my hand, leaned up and kissed my cheek, and said she was sorry the board meeting had run long. That was it. No entrance speech, no look-at-me energy, no performance. She had simply arrived because this was where her husband was, and that was reason enough. The color left Celeste's face so gradually it took a moment to notice it was gone. A few people nearby recognized Ariel before Celeste had time to process what was happening. I heard someone say her name in that way people say names when they're trying to confirm something quietly, almost to themselves, like they were placing a face from a story they'd read. Ariel ran one of the most well-known education funds in Chicago. She had been written about, spoken about, invited to give addresses at events that Celeste would have considered proof of having arrived somewhere in life. And she was standing in this ballroom, holding my hand. Celeste looked at me, then at Ariel, then back at me. She asked with what was left of her composure whether Ariel was actually my wife. The question came out smaller than she intended. Ariel answered simply that yes, she was, and that she was very proud of him. No edge in her voice, no performance of having won something. She said it the way you state something that has never been in question because for her it never had been. Then Ariel leaned slightly toward me and said quietly enough that it wasn't meant for the room that the city had released the formal public announcement that afternoon. The infrastructure contract was now on record official and visible to anyone who looked. She said it the way she might share a small piece of good news from the day, not as a declaration. I nodded. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't need to. Celeste had caught enough of it to understand that something significant had just passed between us. She looked at Ariel and then at me and asked what kind of contract we were talking about. I told her I ran a construction and infrastructure company and that we'd just closed a new deal with the city. I left the number unspoken. The silence where a figure should have been was louder than anything I could have said. For the first time that evening, Celeste had nothing ready. She tried to recover. She suggested we all catch up properly, that it was good to see me doing well, that there were no hard feelings. She was trying to reframe herself as a gracious old friend, rather than the woman who had just spent 20 minutes dismantling her ex-husband in front of an audience. The people around us had gone from laughing along with her to watching her with a different kind of attention, the kind that's harder to stand under. That's when Danica Reeves walked over. She'd been standing against the far wall for most of the evening, and I'd noticed her there, but we hadn't spoken yet. She was a quiet woman by nature, the kind of person who doesn't waste words, which means the ones she does say tend to matter. She looked at Celeste with the calm, measured expression of someone who has already decided what needs to be said and has made her peace with saying it. Danica told Celeste that she'd gone far enough. Then she turned to the small group that had gathered and said that for the past 6 years, the scholarship fund at their old high school, the one that had put dozens of kids from the South Side through college, the one celebrated at every graduation ceremony, had been funded entirely by one person. She named me. She said I had never allowed my name to be placed on the fund, had never appeared at the ceremonies, had never used a single dollar of that giving to build my own reputation. She'd only found out because her job required her to audit financial records connected to city-adjacent organizations, and the trail had led somewhere none of them in that room would have predicted. The ballroom went the kind of quiet where you can hear the jazz trio clearly again, even though they haven't gotten louder. I hadn't planned for this moment. I hadn't called Danica, hadn't set any of this up. She was simply a woman who believed in accuracy, and she had accurate information, and she chose to use it. I couldn't have stopped her even if I'd wanted to. Then she turned to Everett. Her voice didn't change register. She spoke to him the same way she'd spoken about everything else directly, without theater. She said that 2 years ago, a fraudulent subcontractor had been used to attempt to siphon funds from one of my company's active projects, a shell company with fabricated credentials tied to an illegal vendor account. The scheme had been caught before any real damage was done because my legal team flagged the discrepancy early. What no one outside a small group of people knew was that the investigation had eventually crossed her desk because the project was tied to a city contract, and contract fraud fell within her department's oversight. The name attached to that paper trail, after nearly 2 years of following it, was in this room tonight. Everett's face didn't collapse. It did something worse. It went very still, the way a person goes still when they're calculating how much of what was just said can be disputed, and realizing the answer is not enough. He looked at Danica. He looked at the people around him. He did not look at Celeste. Celeste turned to him. She asked him to explain. Her voice had lost all of its earlier performance. It was just a voice now, a person asking a question they already feared the answer to. She said his name twice. She reminded him of things he had told her, that the money was legitimate, that the apartment was paid for, that his business connections were real, that she would never have to worry. She had believed him. She had defended him to her family, to her friends, to anyone who had ever raised a question. She had built her version of success around him, and she was realizing in front of every person she'd grown up with that the foundation had never been there. Everett said without softness that whatever she'd assumed was her own problem. Then he stepped back from her physically, visibly, and began looking for the most efficient route out of the conversation. That was the moment Celeste fully understood what she had traded. The people who had been laughing alongside her an hour ago were no longer nearby. The circle that forms around someone who seems to be winning had quietly dissolved. She was standing in the middle of the room with no audience left to perform for, and the man she had chosen over everything else had just told her in front of witnesses that her grief was inconvenient to him. I watched all of it. I won't pretend I felt nothing. I am still a person who spent years loving that woman, and there is something brutal about watching someone receive a lesson they chose not to learn any other way. But I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. I'd spent a long time imagining this kind of moment, building up some version of it in the back of my mind as a thing that would finally settle something. It didn't settle anything. It just revealed that there was nothing left to settle. Celeste looked at me from across that small, emptied circle. She said she hadn't known, not about the scholarship fund, not about the scale of what I'd built, not about what Everett had done. She said she'd been wrong about me, and I could hear that it cost her something real to say it. I told her the truth because it was the only thing I had left to offer her. I told her that I had known about her and Everett for a long time before the divorce was finalized. That I hadn't said anything because I kept believing she would make a different choice. I'd thought if I just did more, stayed patient long enough, she would eventually see something in me worth staying for. What I didn't understand then, what took me years and a completely different life to understand, was that I had been trying to earn something from a person who had already decided not to give it. You cannot work your way into being seen by someone who has chosen not to look. She asked me why I hadn't said anything, why I had just let her go without a word. I told her that the day she left, I finally stopped waiting for her permission to know my own worth. It wasn't a line I had prepared. It was just the truest thing I could say about why the last 8 years had gone the way they had. Ariel was beside me through all of it, not interrupting, not filling silences, not trying to manage what was happening. She had the rare quality of being able to stand in a difficult room without needing to fix it, which is its own form of strength. When it was clear there was nothing left to say, I took Ariel's hand. We walked toward the exit the way we'd come in at an ordinary pace without looking back to see what we were leaving behind. Behind us, I heard Celeste say my name. Not the way she'd said it earlier in the evening, full of mockery and audience awareness. She said it the way a person says a name when they have finally run out of other options and are left with just the sound of it. I kept walking. There is a particular kind of freedom in not needing the last word. I had spent too many years believing that resolution required a final scene, a confrontation, a confession, A moment where the other person finally understood what they had done and said so. What I'd learned slowly and imperfectly over 8 years of doing things right in the dark was that the resolution had already happened long before tonight. It had happened every morning I got up before sunrise and went to work. It had happened every time I signed a check to that scholarship fund and asked them not to use my name. It had happened at a kitchen table with a woman who had never once asked me to prove I deserved to be loved. The ballroom doors closed behind us. The lobby of the Marriott was quiet and cool and ordinary. Ariel squeezed my hand once. I looked at her and she looked at me, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. We walked out into the Chicago night, and the city was exactly what it always was, large and lit up in all directions, and I felt that I was not carrying anything I hadn't chosen to carry. We drove home mostly in silence, but it was the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Chicago moved past the windows, the lit-up storefronts on Michigan Avenue giving way to quieter streets. The lake somewhere dark to our left. The city doing what it always does, which is continue regardless of what any particular person has just been through. I had one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the center console, and at some point Ariel placed her hand over mine and left it there. The feeling of lightness I'd carried out of that ballroom was real. But somewhere between the expressway ramp and our exit, I became aware that there was still one thing I hadn't fully dealt with. Not Celeste, not Everett, not the room full of people who'd watched the whole thing unfold. Something closer to home, something in a desk drawer. It was Ariel who named it first. She mentioned the notebook, an old composition notebook, black and white marbled cover held shut with a rubber band tucked in the back of the right-hand drawer of my home office desk. She'd found it about a year into our marriage. She said she hadn't read all of it, just enough to understand what it was. Every page had a date in the top corner and a sentence or two beneath it, words recorded carefully the way you record something you're afraid of forgetting. I had started keeping it in the 3rd year of my marriage to Celeste. I told myself at the time that it was just a way of processing things the way some people run or some people drink. But the truth was simpler and harder than that. I was afraid that if I didn't write the things down, I would eventually convince myself they hadn't happened. There is a particular kind of erosion that occurs when someone diminishes you consistently and quietly over time. You start to wonder whether your memory of things is accurate. You start extending the benefit of a doubt that was never extended to you. The notebook was my way of holding the line between what I knew to be true and what I was being told to believe. Ariel asked me why I had held on to it. Not accusatory, just the honest curiosity of a woman who loved me and wanted to understand the parts of me that predated her. I told her it wasn't about evidence. It was about the man in those pages, the version of me who had stood in the rain outside a conference center with wet shoes and an empty wallet, waiting for a woman who walked out and told him he looked pathetic. That man needed to exist somewhere I could find him because he was the reason I never let myself stop moving. Every time I wanted to walk away from something hard, a contract that wasn't coming together, a negotiation going sideways a morning when the whole enterprise felt too large and too uncertain, I could open that notebook and remember exactly how much I did not want to go back to living the way I had lived inside that marriage. The pain had been fuel. I wasn't proud of that, but it was honest. Ariel listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't say anything immediately. She just kept her hand over mine until we pulled into the driveway. We were inside Coates off the house, quiet around us, when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I saw Celeste's name before I could decide whether I wanted to. I picked it up and read the message. She said she was sorry for the things she'd said that evening and for the things she'd done that she hadn't said. She wrote that she hadn't understood what she had until it was gone, and that she hoped I could forgive her someday. I stood in the kitchen and held the phone for a long moment. There was a version of me, the one who had stood under that rain, the one who had filled those pages, who had wanted this for years. Not revenge exactly, but acknowledgement. Some sign that she had seen what she'd done and felt the weight of it. I'd imagined receiving an apology like this one and feeling something release in my chest, some long-held tension finally resolving itself like a knot that had finally come undone. What I actually felt was something quieter and more complicated. I felt sad for her in a way that surprised me. And I felt something else, a faint new awareness, that if I needed to answer this message tonight, if part of me was still waiting for her words to confirm something about my own worth, then the work I thought I'd finished wasn't fully finished yet. Ariel watched me from across the kitchen. She said I didn't owe anyone a response tonight or ever. She said it simply without making it a lesson. I set the phone face down on the counter and left it there. Some doors don't require a dramatic closing. They only require you to stop walking back through them. The next morning I was up before Ariel, which was normal for me. I made coffee and took it out to the back porch and stood there in the early gray light watching the neighborhood come slowly awake. The house was in Gold Coast, but the back porch faced a stretch of old oak trees, and in the mornings it felt less like the city and more like the idea of somewhere quiet where you could actually breathe. I had bought this house because of that porch, not because of the square footage or the address or what it signaled to people who cared about those things. Ariel came out after a while with her own mug and stood beside me. She didn't ask how I was feeling. That was one of the things I loved most about her. She didn't require me to narrate my inner life on demand. She was just there, which was its own kind of answer to everything. After a while, she asked me something I hadn't expected. She asked whether I thought I would have become the same man if the marriage to Celeste had been different. If she had seen me clearly chosen, me fully stayed, would I have found the same drive, the same willingness to tear myself down and start over? It was the kind of question that deserves a careful answer, and I gave it one. I told her I didn't know. I'd like to believe the answer is yes, that the person I was always becoming would have found his way regardless. But honestly, the pain had been a teacher I never would have chosen for myself, and it had taught me things I don't think I could have learned any other way. The refusal to be invisible again, to allow another person's perception of me to become my ceiling that had shaped everything that came after. The company, the contract, the scholarship fund that had quietly changed the direction of lives I would never personally know about. And in some ways, the fact that I had been a man worth knowing when Ariel found me. I went inside after that and took the notebook from the desk drawer where it had been sitting for years. I didn't make a ceremony of it. I didn't stand over a trash can and have a moment. I just held it for a second, acknowledged it the way you acknowledge something that served you and is no longer needed, and let it go. It had done its job. I didn't have to carry it anymore. Later that morning, I called Rochelle. She picked up on the second ring, which is how she always picks up, as if she's been expecting to hear from you. I thanked her for pushing me to go. I told her something had shifted in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, and that it was good. She laughed in that short, warm way she had and said she was glad it hadn't been a disaster. She told me my grandmother, who had passed years ago but whose voice I still heard sometimes in moments that required clarity, would have been satisfied with how I'd handled myself. Not impressed by the contract, not by the revelation, not by Celeste's expression when Ariel walked in. Satisfied specifically because I hadn't lost my composure in a room that had been waiting for me to. That felt exactly right to me. My grandmother had been a woman who understood that keeping yourself steady is not the same as doing nothing. She used to say that a man who can stand in a burning room without catching fire isn't cold, he's just built right. I'd spent years trying to understand what built right actually meant when it wasn't a metaphor. That morning, I thought I finally had something close to an answer. Patience isn't absence. It isn't endurance for its own sake. It is the deliberate choice to keep doing the right thing while everything around you is testing whether you'll abandon it. I had been patient in the wrong way for years inside that marriage, waiting for Celeste to change, waiting for recognition, waiting for the love I was giving to come back to me in kind. That kind of patience is just grief with a polite name. What had actually shaped my life was different. It was the kind that doesn't wait for anyone. It just works and works and works until the work itself becomes the answer. That evening, Ariel made tea. It was something she did on nights that didn't require anything more than being home, a quiet ritual that had become one of the small, reliable goods of our life together. She set 2 mugs on the old wooden table in the kitchen, the one we'd bought from an estate sale in our first year of marriage, when the Gold Coast house was newer and less settled, and we were still learning each other's rhythms. The table was scratched in places. It had been scratched when we bought it. We'd kept it anyway because it was solid and warm and felt like something that had been used by people who sat together and talked and ate and stayed. I sat across from her. The kitchen was the kind of quiet that a house makes when everyone in it is at rest. I thought about the people who'd been in that ballroom the night before. Some of them would talk about what they'd witnessed, the contract, the nonprofit Danica's revelation, Everett's retreat, Celeste's face in the final moments. The $412 million would get mentioned. Ariel's name and work would get mentioned. The scholarship fund would become in the retelling more dramatic than it had actually been. None of that was the victory. I knew that clearly sitting at that table. The victory was this, a wooden table with scratches in it. A woman who had never needed a number to know what I was worth. A home that had come together slowly, one honest decision at a time, out of trust, and the ordinary repetition of days spent trying to do things right. The quiet in my chest where there used to be a voice asking whether I was enough. I hadn't won, because I'd turned out to be wealthier than the woman who'd left me. I had won because I had made a life so genuinely mine that her opinion of it had no structural role to play. She could have walked into that ballroom and said the same things, and I would have left at the same time because I wasn't there to be measured by her. I hadn't been for years. I just hadn't stood still long enough in the same room with her to fully know it until last night. Ariel wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me with the easy attentiveness that had always been one of her gifts, the ability to be fully present without requiring anything of the moment. I looked back at her and felt simply grateful, not in a dramatic way. In the way you feel grateful for something that is exactly what it is and doesn't pretend to be anything else. There are chapters in a life that don't need to end with a confrontation. They don't need a final line that lands like a gavel. They only need you to stop turning back, to reread them, to let the page turn on its own, to trust that what's ahead deserves the full weight of your attention. I picked up my mug. Outside, Chicago was doing what it always does, and inside everything was quiet and warm and exactly enough. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been overlooked by someone who never stopped to look closely enough, then you already understand what Desmond understood. The most powerful thing you can do is keep going, keep giving your best, and trust that a life built on real values doesn't need anyone's permission to stand. If that's something you want more of, subscribe to the channel. Every story here is about people who chose to become someone quietly on their own terms, and what that kind of life actually looks like when it finally comes together.